All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So welcome to our inaugural AWS Reinforce conference. My name is Keith Brooks. I am Senior Manager and Head of Business Development for AWS GovCloud US, and I'm joined here by my esteemed colleague, Mr. Tim Sandage, who is Senior Partner Security Strategist with AWS. And we're going to spend some time this morning talking about GovCloud, and specifically the use cases and workloads and scenarios where customers can leverage GovCloud to meet high compliance in the cloud. And we're also going to talk specifically about a program that we unveiled 2 weeks ago at our AWS Public Sector Summit in Washington, D.C., called the Authority to Operate on AWS, or ATO on AWS, and specifically how ATO on AWS helps customers automate and speed their time to compliance, specifically in GovCloud for customers that have high levels of compliance requirements and regulatory requirements that they have to meet while migrating and architecting workloads for the cloud. So hopefully by now, most of you guys are familiar with the AWS infrastructure, our global infrastructure, which is comprised of 21 regions and 66 availability zones across our global platform. And specifically within the continental US, we have 6 AWS regions, and 2 of those regions are AWS GovCloud US regions. And the genesis with GovCloud really dates back to more than a decade ago when we were talking to customers, particularly in public sector, and they were really interested in understanding how they can migrate and architect workloads in the cloud to meet their highest levels of compliance and regulatory requirements. And we took that feedback back and we thought long and hard about what we needed to do from a cloud service provider to enable those customers to move those sensitive and highly regulated workloads to the cloud. And beyond just public sector customers, we also focused on private industry and specifically organizations in highly regulated industries that, while not government entities, still have some of the same regulatory and compliance requirements that our government customers had to meet. And what we came up with ultimately was AWS GovCloud US, which is a purpose-built set of AWS infrastructure and services that are designed to meet our customers' most stringent compliance and regulatory requirements and sensitive data. We really spent a lot of time thinking about which specific requirements and compliance regimes and regulations we should focus on with GovCloud. And while there were a handful that some of our initial customers really focused on, we wanted to focus on the superset of requirements across government standards, right? So we looked at things like ITAR, which I'll talk about here in a second. We looked at requirements from the US federal government around FISMA. We looked specifically at DOD and some of the requirements that DISA puts in line with our defense customers. We looked broader across things like some of the NIST standards, as well as things like FIPS. We looked at regimes that were applicable to non-government entities as well, things like HIPAA and PCI compliance, and we decided to design with that larger set of compliance and regulations in mind. And the outcome of that was AWS GovCloud, the first region that we launched back in August of 2011, which is now called AWS GovCloud US West. And then after a number of years of customers moving sensitive and highly regulated workloads to the cloud, we last year launched our second GovCloud region, which is AWS GovCloud US East, which is effectively the same setup but for customers that have a geographical preference for the eastern half of the United States. But for the most part, our GovCloud regions really operate, for the most part, like standard AWS regions, right? The services work the same, they're deployed the same, customers have all of the same benefits of using the cloud. But with GovCloud, because of the compliance that we address, we had to really think long and hard about how we design it in a way to allow our customers to architect for that higher level of compliance. And there are a number of distinguishing features that we focus on with GovCloud that position us in a way to allow customers to run more sensitive and regulated workloads. The cornerstone for a lot of our compliance features is the fact that GovCloud is both physically and logically isolated from all other standard regions on our platform. And what that means is data isolation, network isolation, and machine isolation, separate availability zones, separate endpoints for services, and separate implementation and instantiation of services in the GovCloud region. Along those same isolation requirements, we also give customers separate authentication mechanisms in GovCloud. So when customers request access for GovCloud, they're approved for access, and we provision their accounts. They get separate and unique credentials that only work in GovCloud. So again, along the lines of isolation, we wanted to ensure that customers are segmented from their workloads that run in standard AWS regions. We also built a dedicated AWS management console, which works directly with both of our GovCloud regions, separate and distinct from the console that works with standard regions. And then more importantly for GovCloud, we internally, as AWS, operate our GovCloud regions with U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. So that's critically important to a number of our customers, not just in the government, for customers that are in highly regulated industries as well, that have U.S. restrictions around the data and the workloads that they run on AWS. But fundamentally, GovCloud is all about compliance in the cloud, and the 8 logos that are shown here really represent the core in terms of the compliance and regulatory requirements that we focus on with GovCloud, which govern the workloads that our customers that are running their most sensitive and regulated workloads on the AWS cloud turn to us for. I mentioned ITAR at the beginning. So ITAR stands for the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, which is a U.S. government law that governs the import and export of defense and military-related articles that are governed by the U.S. munitions list. And for those not familiar, the U.S. munitions list is effectively a list of defense articles covering things like armament, weapon systems, tanks, fighter jets, and even nuclear data that are considered highly sensitive and export controlled by the U.S. government. With GovCloud, we give our customers the ability to architect and run ITAR-compliant workloads on the AWS cloud. Also, FedRAMP, and specifically FedRAMP High. I'm sure many of you have heard of FedRAMP. So FedRAMP stands for the Federal Risk and Authorization Management, which is a security and control and security and compliance framework of the U.S. government that allows organizations to meet FISMA requirements while using the cloud. And for those not familiar with FISMA, FISMA is the Federal Information Systems Management Act, which was an act that was enabled in 2002 that specifically governs how U.S. federal government entities leverage and run their information systems and data in their environments. So with FedRAMP, we give customers the ability to address FedRAMP High and FedRAMP Moderate workloads and data while using AWS, specifically in GovCloud. Along the same lines as FedRAMP, there is a regime and security control framework that the U.S. Department of Defense uses, which is called the DOD Security Requirements Guide, or SRG for short. And for the most part, think of SRG as FedRAMP with some additional controls specific to the Department of Defense. And with GovCloud, we give our customers the ability to architect for impact levels 2, 4, and 5 in the cloud. 5 specifically allows our customers to run some of the most sensitive Department of Defense workloads on the AWS platform. So again, for customers that have sensitive data, specifically defense workloads and defense applications, they can take advantage of our compliance in GovCloud to run those applications. CJIS, or the Criminal Justice Information Service Security Policy. That is a security policy that is governed by the U.S. Department of Justice, and it specifically pertains to safeguarding law enforcement data in information systems, and as it applies to cloud, in the cloud as well. So with GovCloud, we give our customers the ability to architect for CJIS compliant and run CGI compliant workloads on the AWS platform. IRS 1075 for customers that have sensitive federal tax information or data that they want to run in their workloads. FIPS, which stands for the Federal Information Processing Standard, for customers that have encryption and cryptography standards, particularly our government customers, because FIPS 140-2 is a hard requirement for them. And then NIST, which is really the underpinning of a lot of these compliance regimes that are on the chart here, specifically NIST 853, and 800-171. So 53 mostly pertains to government systems and government data and standards and guidance for how customers can address FISMA requirements via security controls and control families. And then for contractors, whether it's general government contractors or defense contractors, 800-171 is a subset of the 53 controls that pertain to non-government data centers and non-government environments that house government applications and data. And then finally, DFARS, or the Defense Acquisition Supplement, which really is an extension to the FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and specifically focuses on defense and the acquisition and procurement of defense contractors for the Department of Defense. The way to think about DFARS is it comes with a number of compliance requirements that are specifically focused on incident response and cybersecurity. So for defense contractors that want to run highly regulated defense workloads in the cloud, DFARS is applicable, and with GovCloud we give our customers the ability to address DFARS. But it's not just about those 8 compliance regimes, right? So with GovCloud, our customers take advantage of all the standard compliance features that our standard regions have as well. So whether it's things like HIPAA for sensitive health workloads, FERPA for workloads that deal with sensitive student PII, PCI for payment systems, ISO, SOC, and even EAR, or the Export Administration Regulation, which deals with import-export for non-ITAR regulated workloads. GovCloud gives our customers the ability to architect for the highest level of compliance while still meeting some of their core standard compliance as well. And what we've seen over the years is because of that compliance, our customers are increasingly running what the U.S. federal government deems to be controlled and classified information in AWS and specifically in GovCloud. And think of CUI data as information and data that the U.S. government has deemed to be sensitive yet unclassified, mainly because of the implications to our economic interest in the U.S. or defense and national security. So you can see here there are over 20 categories of CUI data. They span from things like export control information, intelligence information, nuclear data, data pertaining to critical infrastructure, privacy, sensitive tax information, etc. And effectively, because of the additional safeguards that come along with handling and processing CUI data, and because of the compliance we offer customers in GovCloud, over the last number of years, our customers are increasingly turning to GovCloud to run these more sensitive levels of unclassified data and applications. And when you look at the various forms and types of organizations that use GovCloud, they really span the gamut, right? Obviously, the U.S. government is the core customer base for GovCloud, both at the federal level and at the state and local levels. But GovCloud is not just for government entities. We have a number of non-government customers across a wide variety of industries that are also using GovCloud for their regulated workloads. Organizations like education institutions. So typically what happens is if a university or an education institution receives a grant from the government, whether it's federal government or the Department of Defense, those grants tend to come with compliance and regulation requirements with it. Well, education institutions aren't in the business of running data centers and compliant infrastructure. So when they get those grants to do their research, they oftentimes run those workloads in the cloud. And for the grants that come with the more stringent requirements, they're running those workloads and hosting that data in GovCloud. Same thing with nonprofits and research institutions and FFRDCs, and even private sector, private industry organizations and highly regulated industries. So aerospace and defense companies, energy companies, particularly the energy companies that deal with nuclear, manufacturing, healthcare, financial services, right? So oftentimes private sector entities that are either dealing with CUI data or data that is deemed to be highly regulated, they're running those workloads in the cloud and specifically on GovCloud to address those compliance requirements. Same thing with consulting firms and system integrators, right? Not just delivering capabilities and workloads for their end customers, but increasingly using GovCloud to run internal applications as well, particularly their business critical applications that power their business that deal with sensitive data. Technology firms, software companies, SaaS companies that are building third-party solutions in GovCloud for end customers, and even managed service providers. And in terms of what those organizations are doing, right, they're doing the same things they do in standard AWS regions. They're just using GovCloud because of the requirements that come with the workloads, right? So whether it's websites and web applications, or data backup and archive and disaster recovery workloads, or customers that are looking at shutting down data centers and whole hog, lifting and shifting and migrating to the cloud and shutting down their legacy on-prem environments. We have customers that are using GovCloud for development and test. We have a number of customers that are using GovCloud for mission-critical applications as well, and even business-critical enterprise IT applications such as ERP and CRM systems that power some of these organizations. Big data, high-performance compute, mobile applications. So again, the same types of applications and workloads that customers are using AWS for in our standard regions, but for the workloads that require the higher bar in terms of compliance, they're using GovCloud for those capabilities. And they're doing that because of a number of things. One, we give them compliant infrastructure as a service and services purpose-built for the regulated data and sensitive workloads that power their mission and business-critical capabilities. And then we also give them the tools and resources to speed their time to compliance. And that's really what we're here today to talk about, is how we can enable customers that have the highest bar in terms of regulations and compliance requirements to address those requirements while still using AWS via AWS GovCloud. And really the genesis of that comes from our customers that understand the compliance and the capabilities we give, but still need a bit more guidance in terms of how to get started. And that's a question we hear often, right? It's how do I actually get started with either migrating those workloads or architecting those workloads from scratch with high compliance in mind. And even in GovCloud, the underpinning of all of this is the AWS shared responsibility model, which hopefully you guys are familiar with this chart. And in GovCloud, with our highest levels of compliance, the shared responsibility model is even more critical. And it really boils down to two layers that we like to talk about the shared responsibility model. The bottom layer represents what we, AWS, are responsible for, which is security of the cloud. So if you look at our AWS Global Infrastructure, we offer availability zones, regions, and edge locations. And then we offer a core set of foundational services across compute, storage, database, and networking that customers build on top of. And we, AWS, are responsible for the security of that platform. Above that is the layers that are most applicable to our end customers, and the layers and specifically the components that they are responsible for, which represent how they configure and develop and operate their environments in the cloud, and customers' responsibility for configuring those environments to be secure in the cloud, right? And that's the delineation. We provide security of the cloud. Customers are responsible for operating securely in the cloud. And when you look at a number of the compliance regimes that I talked to a few minutes ago, as I mentioned, NIST is really the foundation for the broad majority of those. And NIST organizes guidance and regulatory and compliance requirements in components called security controls. And they group security controls in like families. So as you can see here, we list a number of the security control families. And using the AWS shared responsibility model as the anchor, it helps you understand when you architect for high compliance in the cloud, how those security controls spread through the different layers of the stack, right? So again, from an AWS perspective, we're responsible for the global infrastructure and the foundational services. So we take care of the security controls that are applicable at that layer. And as customers, they inherit those controls even at the highest level from AWS. Above that is a number of security controls that are the responsibility of the customer, either through partial or hybrid inheritance from AWS or through full control implementation for the customer. But this is the way that customers have to think about architecting for high compliance in the cloud in terms of security controls, because those security controls dovetail directly into things like NIST, FedRAMP, DOD SRG, and even regimes such as IRS 1075, CJIS, and even ITAR. And the fact of the matter is, we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources to help customers along their compliance journey, right? And when customers build on top of AWS and for their highly compliant workloads inside of GovCloud, we get them roughly at least 60% of the way there, oftentimes even further than that. When we have some customers that have inherited upwards of 75 to 80% of the controls from us, and then they're just responsible for that remaining stack. But even through inheritance, there are some additional best practices and guidance that we'd like to give customers to ensure that, specific to the compliance regimes they have to address, that they architect for the cloud in a formal fashion, right? And we'll start with ITAR. So, as I mentioned, ITAR is all about securing export and import control data in the cloud. And with GovCloud, we have a concept called an ITAR boundary. And think of the ITAR boundary as effectively creating the lanes in the road for where customers can either store and process ITAR data and where it's advised not to store and process ITAR data. The ITAR boundary applies to every single service that's available in both of our AWS GovCloud regions, and it's located in our GovCloud Users Guide. And I've included an example here on the chart of what that ITAR boundary looks like for one of our services, the Amazon Elastic Block Store. And you can see from the ITAR boundary documentation here that customers can store ITAR data that's entered, stored, and processed directly on the volumes of VBS, but it's advised not to store ITAR data in areas such as volume names, snapshot names, and image names. So again, when it comes to architecting for compliance in the cloud, even with the shared responsibility model, these are things that customers have to factor in because the ITAR boundary represents a core input to how customers can architect for running secure ITAR compliant workloads in GovCloud. But it doesn't just stop with the ITAR boundary, right? So with ITAR data, encryption should be a default practice. We always say encrypt, 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 right? And we arm customers with the capability to encrypt their ITAR data that's running in GovCloud. So whether it's taking advantage of features like server-side encryption with Amazon S3, or if you need to take advantage of HSM devices like our AWS Cloud HSM service, which is our managed HSM, or even services like AWS KMS, which is our key management service. We give customers the tools and the features to allow them to encrypt their ITAR data to ensure that they're appropriately restricting it and operating it according to the ITAR regulation. And then architecting for visibility, right? So leveraging services like AWS CloudTrail, which allows customers to track and log all actions that happen in their environments, and even services like AWS Config, which allows customers to govern their environments, track changes, and then take the appropriate remediation actions if their environments change beyond their baseline configurations. And then finally, access control. So AWS Identity and Access Management Service is really the cornerstone of this, right? Because with ITAR, it comes with a set of responsibilities around US restrictions and US controls. More importantly, you have to ensure that only US persons have access to your ITAR environments. That's the responsibility of the customer. So through services like IAM and our security policies and things like access federation, customers can design and architect their ITAR environments in a way to lock down those environments to ensure that folks that are non-US persons or non-US entities cannot access the environment, which could constitute an export control violation. And then along the lines of the shared responsibility model, there are additional responsibilities that customers have to pay very close attention to. As I mentioned, ensuring that individuals qualify as US persons. 2, it's also the customer's responsibility to ensure that they have the appropriate registration and privileges with the US government to process, store, and access export-import control data that's governed by ITAR. And then finally, it's the customer's responsibility to maintain an effective compliance program to ensure that you can convince your government stakeholders and your partner ecosystem that you have the ability to store and process ITAR-regulated data in the cloud. And with GovCloud, we give our customers support to address those requirements. Same philosophy applies with FedRAMP, and as I mentioned, FedRAMP is all about addressing FISMA requirements in the cloud. And specifically with GovCloud, we have infrastructure and services that address the high baseline with FISMA and FedRAMP, which is comprised of 417 controls. And again, NIST 853 is the baseline for all of these controls for FedRAMP. So as you look at the control families and the specific controls that comprise FedRAMP, GovCloud gives our customers a platform and set of services that they can use where they inherit a good majority of those controls and are responsible for addressing the additional controls at the application tiers. But we also arm customers with capabilities and tools to support them no matter where they start, right? So if you're starting from a starting point where you need to migrate data into the cloud and into GovCloud to embark upon your FedRAMP journey, we have capabilities to help you do that, whether you're migrating servers or data or full application stacks. If you're lifting and shifting applications that may run on-prem or in another cloud provider into AWS and into GovCloud, we have support for that. And even if you're building cloud native, right? So if you're starting from scratch and building fully optimized for the cloud, we have a number of capabilities to help customers get going in that journey to address FISMA High and FedRAMP High in GovCloud. And then critically important for FedRAMP is connectivity, and specifically understanding the boundaries of your application, both in terms of the integration points with systems that may run outside of your environment, and connectivity with other cloud applications that are connecting into your environment for whatever reason. And we give customers the ability to address those compliance requirements from a connectivity perspective as well. So whether it's things like the Amazon Virtual Private Cloud, or our VPN service, or even Amazon Direct Connect, if you need to securely connect into your environments and into your GovCloud deployments, we support that and give customers compliant ways to run those workloads to address those FedRAMP requirements. And then finally, inheritance from AWS. We have over 25 services that are authorized at FedRAMP High today. We have another 35 to 40 in the pipeline for FedRAMP High. And that's critically important as well, because as you look at addressing FedRAMP requirements in the cloud, you have to ensure that you're also using cloud services that are also FedRAMP authorized. And this becomes an essential part of customers' architecture. So with GovCloud, with the 25 plus services we have today and another 35 in the pipeline, we are laser focused on ensuring that we have a broad portfolio of AWS services so that they can innovate while still remaining compliant with the FedRAMP regulations. And then finally, the AWS FedRAMP Package. So, even with the architectural best practices and guidance, we also provide customers with a set of documentation that effectively helps serve as their body of evidence for how they address FedRAMP requirements in the cloud. Those things include aspects like our AWS user guide documentation. It includes copies of all of our AWS ATOs that pertain to FedRAMP. It contains the control implementation summary, which shows you which controls we address and which controls the customer is responsible for, and even the customer responsibility matrix and the SSP template as well. So documentation that helps inform customers in terms of documenting how they address FedRAMP requirements in the cloud, but also serving as their body of evidence that they can submit to their auditors and their security officials to help them achieve FISMA and FedRAMP compliance in the cloud and in GovCloud as well. So with CJIS, again, this is all about protecting law enforcement data in the cloud, right? And with GovCloud, we give customers 2 regions to address CJIS security policy in the cloud. And this is important because it applies to all 50 states in terms of the criminal justice agencies and the non-criminal justice agencies that operate CJI, or criminal justice information, workloads on behalf of either their law enforcement customers or the solutions providers that support them. And even though we offer CJIS compliant infrastructure and services, there are still additional best practices that customers have to keep in mind when architecting for CJIS in the cloud. One, similar to ITAR, encrypt everything. Encrypt, 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 both in transit and at rest, right? And we give customers the capabilities to do that. So for customers that are government entities or solutions providers that are selling to the government, again, FIPS 140-2 is a critical component of that. So we give customers the ability to leverage FIPS 140-2 endpoints to ensure that they're communicating with their cloud environment in a secure and encrypted fashion. Same thing with key management. That's a key requirement for CJIS, right? And we give customers the ability to manage their own keys while architecting and deploying CJIS environments on AWS. And finally, if customers need technical review support, right, to support audits from either CJIS authorities or their government customers, we provide organizations with access to that expertise as well. Now, it's important to note, though, that criminal justice agencies and even the non-criminal justice agencies still have their own CJIS responsibilities that they have to focus on. But as in terms of data and technology and architecture, we do provide resources to organizations to help them architect for compliance, for CJI compliance in the cloud with GovCloud as well. And then finally, DFARS. So, as I mentioned, with DFARS, there are particular clauses there that are very germane to defense contractors and aerospace and defense firms. And specifically, there's a clause within DFARS that focuses exactly on covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. And it's specifically the 252-204-7012 clause that covers 5 areas that are very critical for operating DFARS compliant workloads in the cloud. The first is NIST. So the DFARS clause calls out specifically that organizations must maintain NIST 800-171 compliance. And again, 171 is a subset of 853. So with GovCloud, and our FedRAMP high authorization, we address the 853 baseline controls. 171 is a subset of that. So we give customers the ability to address the 171 compliance as it pertains to DFARS. And we take it a step further. So we have a number of AWS quick starts, which are automated deployments for customers to use to provision NIST compliant environments in the cloud as well. So for customers subject to DFARS and specifically that need to meet that requirement, they can check that box. Same thing for FedRAMP, right? 2 FedRAMP authorized regions. We have FedRAMP documentation to help customers architect and establish their body of evidence, and over 25 services with 35 more coming in terms of FedRAMP high authorization. So for customers that have to demonstrate that, they can check that as well. Incident reporting, right? Another category that comes with DFARS, and as you can see, right, customers can address those requirements as well. Same thing with malicious software. And finally, media preservation and protection, right? So for aerospace and defense firms or defense contractors that want to run highly regulated defense workloads in the cloud, DFARS is something that we can help you address, and more importantly, safeguard the critical defense industry data while using the cloud. But we don't stop there, right? So we understand that oftentimes customers need help getting started, right? And we try to address the majority of that with our documentation. So whether it's white papers or like things like our FedRAMP partner package and our security controls matrices, we want to demystify how customers can address security controls on the cloud. I mentioned AWS Quick Start, so that's another mechanism to help speed and automate areas for customers to achieve compliance in the cloud. And then finally, we have compliance SMEs, so whether it's security specialists, security architects, or security-focused professional services individuals, we spend a lot of time and effort and make a lot of investments in ensuring that our customers can operate highly regulated workloads in the cloud. And that brings us to what we, kind of part 2 of what we want to talk about today, which is the Authority to Operate on AWS program, which is a new program that we unveiled at the AWS Public Sector Summit 2 weeks ago. And it's a really innovative program along the same auspices of us helping speed our customers' time to compliance for highly regulated workloads in GovCloud. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tim Sandage, who's going to come up and talk to you guys about ATO and AWS.
All right. Thanks, Keith. Everybody hear me all right? It's always a little bit weird with these, not knowing if you guys can hear me, so I want to make sure we're starting off on a good foot. Like Keith said, my name's Tim Sandage. I run our ATO on AWS program. We actually just launched this officially as an Amazon Partner Network program 2 weeks ago when we were at our DC Summit. And the rationale was behind, all the time that I've been at Amazon, I'm constantly interacting with customers that are calling up and saying, I've got to be compliant with X. And so fill in the blank of X, whether that's PCI, it's FedRAMP, it's DOD, whatever the case may be. Customers have to, comply with these different regulations. And so we needed a way to really wrap this around in a process and a program that would really be driven by our partner community, our Amazon partner community, to help accelerate not only the security and compliance capabilities, but then help and make sure that we got our customers to these points of presence, this ATO, or authority to operate, no matter whether it's in the federal government or it's in financial services, whatever the case may be. So we put together this acceleration capability leveraging what's called infrastructure as code. How many people have heard of infrastructure as code? So it's really the idea of how do we codify against the compliance requirement or the regulatory requirement in advance so that we make sure that we already have the treatments in place in a customer environment so that when they lay down that information, it's already meeting or exceeding in a lot of times the compliance or the security requirements. Because ultimately what this does is it reduces time and cost. It's something that, again, customers are coming to us because they're saying, hey, my business has to be compliant with this thing, and it's taken me 18, 20, 30 months to get through this. This is costing me sell-through, it's costing me business activity and so forth. So that's the other, rationale why we wanted to make sure that we put this together. So we're providing these different templates and capabilities, and we're also doing something that was somewhat interesting to me a few years ago because I hadn't really grasped this as a security professional, hadn't really got into the DevOps, ideology or mode of how do we leverage, continuous delivery, continuous integration and so forth, and really then pair that up with something that we call continuous risk treatment. And so what that really is how do we make sure that once we get you secure and compliant, that we keep you secure and compliant? How many people have been through audits before in their careers? Probably most of us. You know, the usual thing is you go through an audit, you know, you get to that Friday where everybody's happy and it's done and they're giving you the out brief and you high five, and you know, then on Monday you go back to activity as normal until about 6 months to 90 days before the next audit. And then everybody scrambles and says, oh, we've got to tighten up our activities. We've got to go back and do those things that were in the audits. And so that's the other thing that we're really trying to make sure that we treat in this capability is that we want to get you secure and compliant, but we want to keep you that real time so that you're actually able to maintain that heightened security and compliance, kind of the high compliance as Keith talked about, that we provide from a GovCloud environment. We want to make sure that we elevate your customer environment. So as I already mentioned, one of the ways that we're doing this, or really the primary way that we're doing this, is driving this through partners. Because one of the other pieces, going back to that shared responsibility model that Keith talked about, is we AWS, you know, by design, don't get inside your AWS account. We don't work inside your customer environment. We make sure that we leverage partners, you know, such as some of our consulting partners that are in the program, like we've got JHC sitting here in the audience, and Anishan and Coalfire and Shellman and Company are some of our launch partners that launched with this program to help, you know, build and train our customers on this, as well as do integrations of some of the technologies that are involved in this programs, things like, you know, Trend Micro and GitHub and Puppet and Chef and so forth that have been integrated into this, you know, capability, so that out of the box, when a customer calls our team and says, hey, we need help getting through FedRAMP or PCI or whatever the case may be, that we can actually, you know, give them a solution set that actually deploys and lays down quickly, but not only hits that security capability, but it also gets them through that compliance vertical. So these are some of the different, you know, processes and elements that are in the program. And so that, you know, and I've already kind of touched on this a little bit, this is really the why. How many people have been through any of these regulated activities? How many people think that these numbers are accurate? You know, PCI from 0 to hero, you know, 18, 24 months. I mean, we actually had a customer, obviously will remain nameless, that it took them close to 5 years to get through FedRAMP. You know, it's really, you know, sometimes can be very difficult. Even if you're, you know, highly motivated, have all of your ducks in a row in some of these regulations, it's going to take a lot of time because it's engineering, it's documentation, it's integration, it's stitching in your application, you know, into some of these really heightened secure environments that really take some time. And so this was really the other challenge of why we are doing this, is because we've got it going back to security needs to be a business enabler. We can no longer be, you know, the person in the room that says no. We have to be the person in the room that says yes, and let's see how fast and quick we can get you there, but also how much more secure that we can make you. So because now security becomes a business driver, it becomes something that you can actually go to your customers and say, yes, now I actually am secure and compliant in these workloads, and I can maintain this. So it becomes an enablement process as well. So ultimately, these are some of the benefits that I've already talked about. You know, one of the key things is really reducing that effort. I'll talk here in a few minutes about how we were able to really reduce significant time, effort, and capabilities for several customers that we put through this program of just, you know, the sheer time value, you know, the time to market. The other thing is, you know, you're built, you know, end-to-end on automation. As I talked about, everything that we do is based on a security automation and orchestration, you know, methodology that we've set up within AWS, along with our partners, that really follows that you know, that DevOps and SecOps integration, and making sure that, you know, everything that if you have to do any process more than once, you automate it through a CloudFormation template or a Terraform template, whatever the case may be. We're automating everything in the environment. As I said, we had many partners that launched with this program 2 weeks ago. So we had 24 partners that launched with this program, both in the consulting and technology space. This is something, again, the program is twofold. It's to help customers and partners get through regulated workloads, but if then you have a technology or a consultancy capability that can then also empower other partners and customers, then the program's also open for partners and both in the consulting and technology to join the partners and become additional partners in the program. And then the other piece is really making sure that we're integrating more and more services into what we're doing, and making sure that if you are an organization that doesn't necessarily want to manage some of this yourself, that we also have managed service providers, or we have integrators and so forth that can say, okay, not only can we lay this down, but then we can also manage this long term for you and make sure that we maintain it for you. And then these are kind of the benefits from the standpoint of becoming a partner of the program, as you can see, being able to have a go-to-market strategy, having your information up on our ATO on AWS website that I'll share a link with later, having the ability to highlight your capabilities of how your organization, whether it's a technology or consulting partner, can actually help solve some of these difficult pieces. And then obviously in the different verticals, having specific designations like, hey, you're a consulting partner that can really help in PCI or FedRAMP or DOD, whatever the case may be. We want to make sure that we're helping the other partners that are helping our customers get through these regulated workloads within AWS. So I've got a few examples of some of our success stories. How many people have ever heard of Smartsheet? Up until about a year ago, I'd never heard of them, to be frank. And so we got a call about this time last year, little later in July, saying, hey, we need to get Smartsheet through FedRAMP. And oh, by the way, need to get them through FedRAMP in 90 days. And we were like, what? Did we really hear 90 days? And we said, well, we've been building this program and building these processes, and we've been working with partners that we had these theories and these capabilities that we could do this. And so we tapped into one of our main partners that drove this process for us, Encryption, that has their compliance automation stack. And we said, hey, we've got this challenge. Smartsheet's been accepted into this program called FedRAMP Connect, which means it's kind of like a Shark Tank evaluation that says, hey, you've made it through this. You can now go through the process, but you have to complete your full end-to-end audit, build and audit within 90 days. So when we started, Smartsheet didn't even have a GovCloud account. They hadn't even signed up for GovCloud. So we worked with Keith's team. We got them signed up with a GovCloud account. We got Encryption along with several other partners such as Kratos Secure Info and Coalfire and Trend Micro and Puppet and GitHub and some others. And we pulled everything together, leveraging all the CloudFormation templates that we had already been working on and building, laid down the environment in literally a couple of days as far as the general support system, meaning the overall operating capacity. What really was the longest pole in the tent was stitching in their application, which tends to be in these situations. But ultimately we went end to end from zero GovCloud presence to an audited environment in 90 days. And they've now been, if it really wasn't for the government shutdown, they would already have their ATO at this point, but they've been FedRAMP ready since March of this year. And so they should have their ATO any time now. But it was really a significant, example of being able to pull this together and literally under 6 months getting somebody from, zero presence in GovCloud to a complete FedRAMP capability. The next one was a similar story, an organization called Innovest that has a financial services application, and they too didn't know anything about FedRAMP, didn't understand what the complexities and the processes and so forth were, and so they hired Coalfire as their advisor, and again, in a similar fashion, Coalfire laid down, different technologies, Palo Alto, Trend Micro, Splunk, and so forth in the environment, and they were able to get Innovest completely through their build and audit program, and they were audited by Shellman & Company in 6 months, and they ultimately got awarded their ATO in under 10 months. They actually got their ATO, I think, back in May of this year. And so, again, another example of using some of the methodologies and some of the tactics of being able to stitch that DevSecOps capability together and ensuring that we get these, secure and compliant environments up and running quickly, but now they're also running and operating in a DevOps methodology, so they're maintaining that security and capability long term. And then the last one, we just recently finished this one up, and we're actually, we've got the pending audit for this. But as Keith talked about, CJIS is one of those where it's somewhat difficult to help organizations get through CJIS because there's no such thing as a formal audit, more or less. It's usually, the CSA or the police agency or what have you signs off on the audit. But in this case, we're actually taking it through a formal audit at this point. But again, we had a customer, they were actually in Australia, and so they didn't even have a point of presence in GovCloud or personnel initially that could even open up the GovCloud environment, because you had to be a U.S. person on U.S. soil to be able to even create the GovCloud. So we handled that, got them set up in the environment, and then we again used Automation to lay down the environment along with Trend and GitHub and Puppet and so forth. But we got this complete environment up and running in a matter of days. It really took about 30 days overall to do all of the documentation and help them create the policies and procedures to make sure that they had everything in alignment. And then we integrated that with a risk management tool called Allgrass, because their audit authority uses Allgrass as their source of record for managing their risk management program. And so what we've done is we've automated that to where real-time Redflex can report to their audit authority their security and compliance on an ongoing basis through our APIs and some of the integrations that we've set up within the infrastructure as code. So the reality is that this is something that we've been working on for the last couple of years, but it's starting to actually now pay, fruition, because we've really followed some major tenets within our program. As I said, if it's got to be done more than once, we're going to automate it. And so it doesn't matter if it's provisioning, user IDs, or it's, encrypting services, whatever the case may be, we're going to make sure that it's managed through automation, all with the idea that we're ultimately working towards some level of certification, whether it's a third-party, audit and certification like PCI or FedRAMP, or it's something like CJIS or DFARS or something that's still a self-attestation, but we want to make sure that we're meeting those certification requirements. And then ultimately inside that automation, one of the things, and this is why it was really important to marry up to the DevOps community and leverage things like GitHub Enterprise inside the accounts, and making sure that we're leveraging Puppet, Chef, Ansible, and so forth, is that we need to be able to validate those drastic and quick changes that are happening in the environment. And so we're constantly doing validation to say, does this meet and does this stay inside that swim lane or those guardrails of our security compliance capability. And so the last one is really, as I said, security in this case is really becoming an empowerment. We're really empowering the business to be able to be more secure, more compliant, and stay that way by leveraging some of these tool sets. And again, going back to the original piece, is how do we reduce the effort, time, and ultimately what we're still working on is how do we drive down the costs of some of these things too, to make sure that the cost of ownership of some of these certifications isn't so grand any longer. So ultimately, this was, our goals that we set out when we started building this a couple of years ago, is that we wanted to be able to have a verifiable compliance capability, a solution that says, hey, out of the box, leveraging security automation and orchestration, we know as a blueprint that this is secure and compliant as it sits. So as I build this and I get to an as-built audit or certification, I can validate that what I had planned in my blueprint is actually what came to fruition. And so that we have these outcomes of really accelerating, dropping this idea that it's going to take 18 to 24 months to get through a FedRAMP process, or PCI, 18 months or 12 months to get through a PCI audit and so forth. And then really improving the security and compliance posture. I mean, you look at every day we wake up and we see these different breaches out there. Now our state and local governments are being attacked by ransomware on, feels like a daily basis. We need to make sure that we're improving this security and compliance, because I don't know about any of you in the audience, but if you have too many employees in your organization, raise your hand, because none of us are getting more and more employees. I mean, we're being asked to do more with less, and so we need to make sure that we automate and we validate our capabilities, because ultimately we're trying to reduce the overall efforts that it takes to get through these processes, but also then maintain these processes, and so we want to be able to develop this constant demonstratable capability that at any point in time I can prove that I'm secure and compliant to a specific control or a control set, so that we can make sure that we're constantly at a secure and auditable state real time is really what the goal of our program is. And as you've seen already in some of our initial proof of concepts that we completed this last year and this year, and we've got a multitude that are going on right now using a lot of these same pieces, this is really something that's starting to make a difference in the community, and making sure that we're leveraging the back-end infrastructure of the AWS GovCloud to do this, and then ensuring that we're empowering our customers on top of that. With that, I've got just a few slides up here, or links for different elements, both in GovCloud and within our program. If you're interested in learning more about GovCloud or learning more about the AWS, the ATO and AWS program, there's links here for customers as well as for partners. I'll get out of the way while you're taking pictures, because I'm right in the middle of probably an important URL. But with that, unless Keith, you got anything else? With that, I appreciate your time today, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.